The fog lay on the Attu shoreline like a lid, turning the world into sound and touch. Aihara Kenji came out of it with 2 American soldiers locked on his elbows, his boots heavy with seawater and tundra muck. Each time his knees buckled, the escorts hauled him upright before he could drop out of sight. In that fog, a body on the ground invited a mistake. A canvas holding tent squatted behind a low rise, its guy lines vanishing into white. Wet rime clung to the fabric. A stovepipe coughed thin smoke that the air refused to carry away. Inside, the floor was a churn of slush, ice, and tracked-in gravel. A table stood by the entrance with forms stacked under a bayonet sheath. Frank Delaney, sleeves rolled and pencil ready, looked up as the escorts pushed the prisoner into the light. Delaney measured arrivals by 2 clocks that ran together on Attu, security and body heat. Aihara tried to straighten when the soldiers released him, but his legs did not answer cleanly. His jaw clenched as a shiver shook him hard enough to blur his vision. His hands were bare and waxy, fingertips numb past judgment. Delaney pointed Aihara to the end of the table and kept his eyes on the prisoner's hands. One guard pressed Aihara's wrists to the tabletop where everyone could see them. Another pulled a wool blanket from a thinning pile and threw it over Aihara's shoulders. The blanket's edges were damp, but it cut the wind that leaked through the seams. The search started immediately, buttons stuck in frozen cloth. Aihara's fingers fumbled at his coat with slow, inaccurate movements that made the nearest rifle track him a fraction. An escort took over, stripping the garment away and dropping it to the floor. Delaney wrote the first entries while watching the hands more than the items. Outer coat, inner shirt, pockets turned, waistband checked. A medic stationed near the stove stepped in and pressed fingertips into Aihara's forearm, watched the color return too slowly, then checked ears and fingertips for the first signs that would force a harder intervention. A tin cup appeared, steam barely visible. The guard held it to Aihara's lips because his hand shook too much to lift it without spilling. Aihara drank and gagged on the heat, then swallowed again. Delaney marked condition as hypothermia risk and wrote the time and capture location as best they could reconstruct in the fog. When the search reached Aihara's breast pocket, the escort's fingers paused on something stiff and narrow. He pulled it free and held it up, a single cigarette, paper crumpled, tobacco pressed tight by sweat and salt. Aihara's eyes locked on it with a focus the cold had denied him. He leaned forward under the blanket, and the nearest guard's rifle shifted in response. The young private who had found it smirked and started to let it fall into the slush with the rest of the emptied pockets. Delaney stopped him with a raised hand and a look that cut the grin short. Delaney took the cigarette and set it on a square of oilcloth beside the form, away from the stove, away from any stray match. He wrote a line for it, then paused because the line was not just an inventory. It was a decision. Delaney moved to identity, name, age, rank, function. The escorts translated with blunt words and gestures. Aihara answered in measured bursts, breath thin. When he indicated radio duty, Delaney's pencil stopped for a half beat. On Attu, men went missing in the fog because messages failed, because a call sign was wrong, because a schedule slipped. A radio man was not a common prisoner. Outside the tent, boots splashed past. A runner pushed through the flap with a wet scrap of paper and a glance that said the Ridge Patrol was late. Late patrols meant nerves. If the perimeter had to contract, men would be pulled from watch to search, and classification had to be finished before staffing dropped. Aihara watched the shift without understanding the words, but he understood tempo. The cigarette became his only visible lever. He tried to signal that it mattered, that it steadied him, that without it he could not keep his thoughts arranged. His hands rose a fraction from the tabletop before he forced them flat again. The restraint came late, but it came. Delaney saw the movement and chose not to gamble. He did not hand the cigarette back, and he did not throw it away. He slid it into a small paper envelope and wrote the prisoner's temporary number on the flap. Not sealed yet. He left the disposition blank. Pending. That blank kept the object inside the record chain where it could be accounted for, and it kept Aihara from reading one gesture as safety. Delaney assigned Aihara to the warmer side of the tent, close enough to the stove to slow heat loss, but far enough to keep space and sight lines. A guard guided him down onto a crate and held position between Aihara and the door. The medic adjusted the blanket, checked the fingertips again, and had the guards rub warmth into Aihara's hands through the wool without exposing skin to air. Time spent warming was time not spent searching, and time spent searching was time the cold kept stealing. Delaney set the envelope beside the form, weighed down by the bayonet sheath. Outside, the fog continued to swallow sound and distance. Inside, ink dried on a line that would decide what Aihara could touch, where he could sit, and whether his next hours were spent alive enough to be questioned. Delaney left the cigarette envelope on the table where the bayonet sheath held it down. He did not seal it yet. Pending lines stayed pending only as long as the room remained orderly, and order was thin on Attu. The canvas walls breathed cold each time the wind shifted. Wet boots made the floor slick. Aihara sat on the crate near the stove, blanket tight, hand still watched, heat returning in small, painful stings. The medic came close and pressed 2 fingers into Aihara's wrist, then into the soft spot below his jaw. The pulse was fast and shallow. The medic rubbed warmth into Aihara's hands through the wool, then checked the color in his fingertips and the stiffness at the joints. The act was not gentle, just efficient, and it ended as soon as the circulation looked less dire. A guard guided Aihara back to the entrance table before the warming could soften the perimeter rules. Delaney resumed the form with the same sequence he had started: identity, function, disposition. The escorts relayed his prompts with minimal language. Aihara answered with a steadiness that did not fit his body. His voice came out thin, and he paused to swallow each time the shiver clenched his throat, but he kept his eyes fixed on the pencil. The pencil meant the next door, the next corner, the next pair of hands on him. His first attempt to seize control was built from the trait that had served him in radio work: precision. He supplied details quickly and in clean order, but he bent them. The changes were small enough to survive a casual record and sharp enough to force a careful clerk to stop. Aihara shortened a place name, shifted a number in a duty roster, and reduced his own responsibilities from operator to helper. He did it while keeping his wrists flat on the table and his shoulders still, as if the stillness could hide intent. Delaney did not contest the answers in front of the guards. He slowed down instead. He pulled a second sheet from the stack, the one used for inconsistencies and follow-up notes, and wrote the same prompts again. He had the escort restate Aihara's responses in the same order. Then he asked for them a third time with the guard's hands still on Aihara's wrists and the medic watching the prisoner's breathing. Delaney circled the mismatches and initialed beside each circle. The circles were evidence that would outlast the fog. The immediate consequence fell like a latch. Delaney marked Aihara for stricter watch and delayed interview priority, a category meant to keep a prisoner separated until a specialist could examine his story under controlled conditions. The guards responded to the mark without comment. One stepped closer behind Aihara's shoulder. Another shifted his rifle to a higher ready position. The medic's face tightened because standing at the entrance meant losing heat, but the medic did not overrule the custody line. Aihara adjusted his strategy in the only direction the cold left him. He moved from the mind to the body. He lifted his chin toward the envelope, then toward his mouth, then held still again, presenting the request as a need rather than a challenge. His throat burned from the damp air. His hands tingled with pain as sensation returned in uneven bursts. The cigarette became a promise of steadiness, a way to slow the tremor and prove he could still act inside their system. Delaney read the gesture and refused to let it become a test of dominance. Fire inside the tent meant light, focus, and a crowding of attention around a single point. A match hand could hide a blade. An ember could be used as a signal or as a distraction while the guard's eyes moved. Delaney slid the envelope farther from the stove and wrote a new note beside the inventory line. No access until fire source separated and custody complete. He looked to the guards and set their hands back on Aihara's wrists, forcing stillness to become a rule rather than a choice. One young private, wet-faced and eager, leaned toward Aihara as if the delay should be used to punish. Delaney cut the impulse off by assigning the private to a different duty and forcing him to sign his initials on the supply list, a reminder that every act in the tent could be traced. The private moved away, resentment visible but contained. Delaney kept his posture calm because calm traveled faster than words in a room full of armed men. The fog outside thickened, turning footsteps into sudden appearances. A runner came through the flap with a message that a ridge patrol had not checked in on schedule. That absence tightened the tent. Guards looked toward the door. Aihara's head turned a fraction before he checked himself, because a turn could be misread as a reach. A second message followed minutes later, reporting movement in the fog with no confirmation of numbers or direction. Rifles were checked. The flap was pulled shut hard enough to make the canvas snap like a sail. Delaney's choices narrowed. In a higher alert state, any ambiguity around property could trigger a violent reaction, either from guards who feared a weapon or from a prisoner who believed the chain had failed. Delaney finished the minimum identifiers he could support, then sealed the cigarette envelope with deliberate care. He pressed the flap down, stamped the temporary number across the seam, and wrote the time of sealing. The act turned the cigarette from a personal comfort into a controlled item whose handling now required a documented handoff. Aihara watched the seal go down and understood what it meant for the next hours. His request had not been refused in the way a man refused a favor. It had been absorbed into a rule. The guard guided him away from the entrance table, not toward the stove, but toward a corner where a tighter watch could be maintained without blocking traffic. The blanket stayed on his shoulders, but the heat faded as he moved. In the fog, the camp held its breath, and Aihara's room to maneuver shrank to the width of a pencil line. Delaney kept the sealed cigarette envelope in a shallow tray under his elbow, close enough that any reaching hand would have to cross his forearm. The tent stayed crowded and cold, the stove line never clearing. Aihara sat under watch with the blanket on his shoulders, heat returning slowly enough to sting. When Delaney brought him back to the table, Aihara chose a different approach. He stopped bending answers to test the clerk. He gave name, age, and duty in the clean order of a man trained to keep sequences under pressure, then repeated them the same way when the escort restated the prompts. His wrist stayed flat. The guard behind him kept a hand close to the back of his collar, ready to pin him if the stillness broke. Delaney did not erase the earlier circled mismatches. He wrote the now consistent identifiers beside them and initialed both. The record grew heavier, not cleaner. Then he moved to property. He slid the tray onto the oilcloth and laid out what had been collected: damp coins, a small comb, a cloth patch, a wallet softened by water, and the cigarette envelope sealed across its flap with Aihara's temporary number. Aihara's gaze moved over the layout and stopped at an empty space. His jaw tightened. The brief tremor that had been easing returned and made his elbows scrape the tabletop. He forced them down again and signaled without lifting a finger, angling his chin toward the inside of his coat and then back to Delaney's pencil. Delaney took the soaked coat from the pile and turned it inside out again, tracing seams and cuffs with methodical fingers. He shook slush and grit to the floor, then checked the inner shirt and waistband where paper could cling. Nothing appeared. Aihara's breathing sped under the blanket. He kept his wrists planted, but his eyes flicked to the cigarette envelope and away, as if one sealed item made the absence of another more dangerous. Delaney opened the property logbook to the intake block and ran his finger down the item column. The cigarette line was there with the sealing time and his initials. The other items were there. There was no entry for any waxed packet or folded paper. For a man marked radio duty, that blank mattered. If such an item had been taken and not recorded, it was outside the chain. If it had been lost, it could reappear without proof of where it had come from. Delaney turned the logbook slightly so the escorts could see the gap and directed them to empty their pockets onto the oilcloth. Mud, wrappers, pencil stubs, a few small bits of gear appeared. No packet. He had the runner who had handled the tray do the same. The searches consumed minutes and pulled eyes from the stove line, but Delaney kept them visible and controlled because uncontrolled suspicion would end in violence. Aihara watched every pocket emptied with contained intensity. He could not explain what he feared without escalating it. A fragment of authentication or cipher material linked to his body would make him a higher priority communication source. A vanished fragment that later surfaced could be treated as proof of concealment and destruction. Either path meant tighter isolation and harsher custody. The young private who had grinned earlier stepped toward the table, posture eager to turn the discrepancy into punishment. Delaney intercepted him with a hard forearm over the tray and redirected him to exterior watch. He made the private sign the roster change on the spot, forcing the impulse into an accountable entry and pushing the heat of it out of the tent. Delaney wrote a plain entry in the logbook. Inventory discrepancy raised by prisoner. Follow-up searches of escort personnel conducted. Negative result. He added a line that forced the next handoff to account for the gap, then assigned a guard to trace the route from the shoreline approach to the tent flap, hands sweeping the ground and edges where a small waxed packet could have dropped in the fog. The sweep slowed intake and pulled manpower from the interior. Delaney compensated by tightening what he could tighten. He marked Aihara's custody category one notch stricter in the margin, tying it to the discrepancy and the earlier inconsistencies. The mark changed where Aihara could sit and how close a guard would stand, and it pushed any specialist interview farther down the queue for the next day. Aihara absorbed the shift and recalibrated. He reduced himself to stillness and repetition. When Delaney prompted him again for identifiers, Aihara delivered them without deviation, offering consistency as currency in exchange for a predictable sequence. Delaney did not grant comfort, but he granted sequence. He authorized warming in the only order the tent could sustain: hot drink, dry wrap, then low movement posture near the stove with hands visible. He kept the cigarette envelope in the tray and added a conditional notation beside it. The cigarette would remain tied to Aihara's number, but access would be limited to a guard-controlled fire source, and only after the discrepancy was either resolved or formally logged through the next handoff. The sweep returned with wet gloves and nothing that could be proven. Delaney recorded the negative result and left the discrepancy open rather than bury it. He stamped the intake sheet again and sent Aihara back toward the warmer side of the tent because a dead prisoner could not be sorted and a living one could be managed only if the rules stayed visible. Aihara sat on the crate near the stove with the blanket tight around his shoulders. Heat returned in sharp waves that made his fingers ache. Across the tent, the tray with his property remained within sight but beyond reach, the cigarette envelope sealed and labeled, the missing line still blank. Between the object he could see and the object he could not, Aihara understood that the record now governed his body as surely as the cold. The Ridge Patrol did not return on schedule. A runner pushed through the flap with a damp note and a face tightened by cold. Delaney read it once, folded it, and slid it beneath the logbook. He spoke quietly to the nearest guards, then pointed toward the entrance and the tent's narrow traffic lane. The room changed at once. Men who had been focused on blankets and cups turned their attention to the fog outside. Rifles were checked, and the stove's heat became less comfort than hazard, a bright center that drew bodies together when the perimeter needed clear angles. Delaney kept writing, because anything left unwritten became an argument, and arguments in that fog ended fast. Aihara sat near the stove with a blanket clamped tight around his shoulders. Sensation returned to his hands in stinging bursts, but the pain did not steady him. The property tray remained on the table. His cigarette was sealed in its envelope. The discrepancy line in the logbook was still open. The alert order came down to consolidate custody and simplify the interior. That meant fewer prisoners per space, shorter movement paths, tighter watch, and less time spent improvising. Delaney flipped Aihara's intake sheet and marked the sheet with the alert state. He then circled Aihara's stricter category mark and underlined it. The earlier inconsistencies and the missing item entry locked Aihara into that column. 2 guards lifted Aihara off the crate. The motion pulled the blanket open and let cold air hit his chest. Aihara rose carefully, but his legs still carried the lag of hypothermia. His boots slid on slush, and his torso dipped as he fought for balance. The guard nearest him read the dip as a turn. A rifle barrel rose. Aihara's hands came up by reflex, palms half open, then dropped back to the tabletop as he forced them down. The movement was enough to trigger restraint. The guard behind him seized the back of his collar and drove him forward, hard enough to remove choice, but not to injure. Aihara's knee struck the crate. Pain shot cleanly up his thigh. He kept his mouth closed because sound drew eyes, and eyes invited escalation. Delaney stepped into the space between fear and punishment. He placed Aihara's hands flat on the table and had a guard keep them there. He waved the medic in. The medic checked Aihara's fingertips, pressed a palm through the wet shirt to confirm how cold the skin still was, then brought a cup of hot liquid and held it to Aihara's lips. Aihara drank in controlled swallows, eyes fixed on Delaney's pencil. Delaney tightened the rules in a form that could survive a handoff. He wrote that the prisoner stumbled due to hypothermia symptoms during movement control. He wrote that hands rose in reflex and returned to compliance immediately. He wrote that no attempt to reach property occurred. He initialed the line and added the time. The difference between reflex and reach now lived in ink, not in a guard's memory. The fog outside pressed harder against the canvas, turning the entrance into a white membrane. Another runner brushed past, reporting movement without confirmation. Guards shifted their stance. In that posture, any object could become a provocation, and any provocation could become an irreversible act. Aihara angled his chin toward the sealed envelope and then toward his shaking hands. He did not speak in the language the guards used, but he made the request legible. He needed something to slow the tremor and keep his body predictable under watch. A guard reached for the envelope as if to remove it from the room. Delaney caught the wrist and stopped the reach without drama. He did not treat the cigarette as a favor, and he did not treat it as contraband to be destroyed. He treated it as a control problem inside a medical problem. Delaney took a small metal ration tin from a supply box and set it near the stove where the light and heat allowed close supervision. He pulled a supplemental sheet used when standard intake did not cover field conditions and drew 3 boxes in a row. He labeled them in the plain terms the tent already obeyed: blanket on, hot liquid administered, identity recorded. Below them he added a 4th line for a personal stabilizer, then wrote cigarette. He added spaces for who controlled the flame, where ignition occurred, where the butt was extinguished, and whether the envelope was resealed after use. In war, a humane checklist can function as both rescue and interrogation. Delaney signed the supplemental sheet and clipped it to Aihara's packet. He drew a line from the cigarette entry to the stricter custody category and wrote the condition that turned permission into a threshold: access only after the 3 stabilization boxes were checked and only if hands remained visible, and movement control was followed without deviation. The rule did not soften custody, it made custody legible. Delaney took a matchbook from the supply box and handed it to a guard, not to Aihara. He wrote the guard's initials into the flame control space. He then opened the cigarette envelope by cutting along the stamped seam so the temporary number remained visible. He slid the cigarette onto the oilcloth and pushed the empty envelope back into the tray. Aihara's breath hitched at the sight, but his hands stayed flat. The guard struck a match and cupped the flame. Delaney placed the ration tin beneath the working area to contain ash and to keep hands in a defined zone. The guard brought the flame to the cigarette tip while Aihara leaned forward only as far as the guards allowed. Aihara did not lift his hands. He drew once, then held the cigarette between 2 fingers low under the blanket, close to his chest, where every motion could be watched. The smoke rose and flattened against the canvas ceiling. The smell cut through damp wool and wet canvas. The effect on Aihara was immediate and visible. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his eyes steadied. The tremor in his wrists slowed enough that the guard's grip eased by a degree. He was not calm, he was predictable. Delaney recorded the time of first use and checked the 3 stabilization boxes in order, then marked the supervised use line. The Ridge Patrol's status remained unresolved, and the tent would rotate personnel. The marks were not comfort, they were a chain. A runner returned with word that contact had been reestablished, but the alert did not vanish. It loosened. Delaney used the small loosening to move Aihara back toward the stove, because a man slipping into failure created more danger than a man held close and warm. Before the move, the guard stubbed the cigarette in the ration tin, and Delaney sealed the remaining stub into the envelope with fresh initials and a new time mark. Aihara followed the movement control without deviation, because any deviation would be written down and used to justify the next tightening. When Aihara sat again near the stove, the property tray remained within sight and beyond reach. The cigarette was no longer a point of argument or a point of mercy. It was an entry tied to boxes, initials, and a category mark that governed how he would be handled through the next 24 hours. By morning the fog still held, but the camp had settled into a steadier rhythm. The Ridge Patrol had reestablished contact, and the perimeter did not collapse. The alert state eased into a watch posture that could be sustained. That did not mean lenience. It meant routine. Delaney's tent ran on handoffs. A man with a pencil could leave for a shift change, and the chain would only survive if the next pencil could pick it up without guesswork. Delaney laid Aihara's packet on the table and walked the incoming corporal through the entries. Identity lines, the circled mismatches, the open discrepancy note, and the supplemental sheet with its boxes and initials. Delaney did not describe motives. He described actions and consequences and the conditions that had produced them. The corporal read the supplemental sheet and raised his eyebrows at the cigarette line. Delaney tapped the line that tied it to flame control and to the stabilization boxes. The corporal nodded once, understanding that the cigarette was not an indulgence, but an instrument that reduced risk when used inside a boundary. Aihara woke on a crate near the stove. still wrapped in the blanket. The heat had kept him from sliding into failure during the night, but it had also kept him under the closest watch. His fingers hurt with returning circulation. The ache proved he was alive. It also made his hands hard to control. A guard guided him to the table at set times, not because Aihara asked, but because the packet required periodic checks. Hands and feet inspected for frost damage, hydration noted, behavior category reviewed. The same 3 boxes were used each time to anchor the day's tempo: blanket, hot liquid, identity check, then the conditional line. The cigarette entry traveled through the shift change like any other item. When the corporal controlled the flame, the corporal wrote his initials. When a different guard did it, the initials changed. Aihara learned quickly that his access depended on visible compliance, not on persuasion. He kept his hands flat when prompted and moved only when told. The guards responded by keeping the cigarette within reach of the process, never within reach of his pocket. The open discrepancy did not vanish. The sweep had found nothing. The escorts had produced nothing. Delaney's note forced the next station to see it, and seeing it forced a choice. If the missing item could not be accounted for, then the chain had to declare it unresolved rather than pretend it never existed. That declaration shaped custody. It justified tighter isolation and more careful movement control, and it ensured that any later discovery would be measured against the ink already on the page. Aihara tested the new routine in the only way left to him. He offered consistency. When asked for identifiers, he delivered them without deviation. When prompted for duty, he stayed within the same lane he had settled into after the tightening, neither minimizing nor expanding. He did not volunteer additional detail. He waited for the next prompt and answered it in the same sequence. He treated the intake form as a set of rails he could ride to a predictable outcome. The guards noticed. They did not soften their posture, but they wasted fewer motions on him. They did not crowd him with unnecessary hands. They moved him on short paths with clear commands, because fewer complications meant fewer mistakes in fog. Delaney's rule, now carried by other men, kept the fire source separate and the cigarette supervised. Each use was brief. Each butt was extinguished in the ration tin. Each remainder went back into an envelope, sealed, initialed, and time-stamped. In that way, the cigarette became less a thing than a repeated demonstration. Aihara could be given a controlled privilege and could comply with its constraints under stress. Later in the day, an officer from a communications function came through the tent to triage possible radio-related prisoners. He did not interrogate on the spot. He skimmed packets, looking for markers that justified a later controlled session. Aihara's packet offered 2 markers in opposing directions. The earlier inconsistencies and the unresolved discrepancy argued for higher suspicion. The repeated supervised cigarette entries argued for stable compliance under defined conditions. The officer's pencil circled Aihara's number for follow-up and moved on. Aihara watched the packet leave the table and return, and he understood that the record was moving ahead of him through channels he could not see. He had wanted the cigarette as a private anchor in a world of confiscation. Instead, it had become a public metric that traveled with his number, shaping how strangers would handle him. By the time a full day had turned, the supplemental sheets boxes were no longer a single improvisation. They had been copied onto fresh paper for new intakes because they worked. They prevented prisoners from slipping into hypothermia collapse while guards were distracted by the fog in the perimeter. They gave watchstanders a way to allow a small stabilizer without surrendering control of fire and without losing traceability. Aihara sat under the blanket near the stove, hands visible, waiting for the next scheduled check. The cigarette envelope rested in the tray under a new guard's elbow, its seam stamped and initialed in a hand that was not Delaney's. The missing line in the property log remained open. and it kept Aihara's custody category from dropping. The rules had preserved his life, and the rules had also sealed his world into a set of boxes and initials that he could not escape by argument or pride. In the fog outside, the battle's larger outcome continued beyond the tent, fixed by forces Aihara could no longer influence. Inside, his fate narrowed to the things he could still do: keep his hands visible, keep his answers consistent, and survive within the record that now governed him.